Part of me thinks it's unfair to try and review an early access game. Games change tremendously with even small tweaks and polish and the addition of more content, so many of the things I would praise or criticize in a finished game aren't fully implemented yet, and so it's not really worth talking about them. But then I think about how many great early access games I've played that would have been perfectly reasonable to review. Gloomwood is so good I stopped playing it after the second major update because I want to play it all at once when it comes out. But if I had reviewed it, I would have praised it to high heaven. And sometimes an early access game has such fundamental flaws, I think it's fair to review it to take note of the fact that a game will not succeed in its current form. Heart Machine Games is a well-regarded indie studio that has made 2 critically acclaimed games. Their first, Hyper Light Drifter, is almost universally loved and still stands up as one of the best and most inspired indie games of the last 10 years. The second game was a bit more divisive. Critical reception was mixed, with some outlets giving it very high scores and others rating it as kind of mediocre. I personally didn't really care all that much for Solar Ash, but many people really seemed to like it, and I ultimately decided that even though it wasn't for me, I could see that there was an audience for the game that would love it. Heart Machine revealed their new game 2.5 years ago, and it was met with overwhelming positivity. A 3D sequel to Hyper Light Drifter was what almost everyone actually wanted the studio to be working on. And then a little more than 1 year ago, the gameplay trailer revealed that Hyper Light Breaker was a multiplayer roguelite with a procedural open world. People still seemed to like it, and the game certainly looked good, but for me at least, this was a bit of a disappointing reveal. How is the grim and lonely tone of Hyper Light Drifter going to be maintained in a roguelite? How is the mystery and atmosphere going to survive a co-op game? I didn't understand how Heart Machine planned to marry these 2 very different genres of game. Still, the gameplay in the trailer did look pretty interesting, and the procedural open world at least sounded like a new idea for the genre. Well, I've put about 18 hours into Hyper Light Breaker, and it honestly pains me to say this, but the game in its current state is fundamentally flawed to its core. It does not play well as an action game, it doesn't seem to understand what makes the roguelite genre work, and worst of all, it's not very good at being a hyperlight game. To show you this, we're going to start with the most important thing in any video game, the gameplay. How an action game feels. I'll just restate, this game is in early access, so there are major problems that can be fixed. But this game is for sale for $30, and I think it's more than fair to point out huge problems that need to be addressed before it's good. One of the things that defines an action game is how it feels in your hands. I didn't love Solar Ash, but many people I respect did love it, and ultimately I decided the game just wasn't really built for me. But Hyper Light Breaker is a game built for me. I love action games. I love roguelites and roguelikes, and I adore Hyper Light Drifter. With Solar Ash, I still think it's a very well-made game. I found the story was a bit trite, and I don't think the voice acting was good enough for such a story-heavy title, and while the movement did feel good, I just ultimately didn't think that the game did enough with it. Still, the movement was good. The speed and physics felt great, and jumps felt responsive and tight, and the game was built around using that movement in interesting ways. So when I saw the sequel to Drifter was going to use a hoverboard in the trailers, I assumed that Heart Machine had iterated on the skates from Solar Ash and would have the movement feeling great. In fact, combining the things that Drifter did really well with the things that Solar Ash did really well is a recipe for a great game. But, in fact, Breaker does not improve on the movement system in Solar Ash. In fact, movement feels significantly worse in Hyper Light Breaker than it does in Heart Machine's last game. To start with, the character turns strangely. I play melee action games with a controller, which is what Heart Machine recommends, and one of the first things I do when starting a new action game is run my character around in little circles to see how it feels. Turning in Hyper Light Breaker has the Dark Souls 2 thing where you do not get a smooth turning radius. Instead, the character seems to snap to different turning points. This is hard to describe, but when you play it, you feel it. In the very best action games, you won't find yourself unable to climb a spiral staircase or getting frustrated climbing up a hill. In the best action games, you forget that you're using a controller at all. But in Breaker's current state, moving simply doesn't feel good. This is particularly an issue in combat where your character will constantly fail to do what you want them to do. This is compounded by the game's very bad collision and geometry. Your character will get stuck on curbs. Slightly bumping a wall brings you to a dead stop. All this sounds like piddling stuff, but it adds up to a deeply unpleasant experience. It does not feel good to move your character in the game, and that is a death knell for an action game, especially one built upon an open world. Movement is way too slow at default speed, and the collision, physics, and speed are even worse on the hoverboard. You slow down to an absurd degree going up tiny hills. There's nowhere at all to actually use the movement system in a way that is fun. This game could desperately use the rails that are a core aspect of Solar Ash. The landscape you walk across simply doesn't feel as if it has taken the hoverboard into account. The hoverboard is not a gameplay mechanic in any significant sense. It's a source of frustration rather than a source of joy. And again, everything is at least 10% too slow, probably more. I went back to play Solar Ash for this video, and the movement speed and game feel is just miles beyond what is currently in Hyper Light Breaker. Now, in this game, there's an item that increases movement speed by a bit, but you'd be crazy to choose that item over combat-focused items. And it's always a terrible idea to create an item to fix a problem that should not be in the game to begin with. There's just constant friction in the movement in this game. The hoverboard often won't deploy when you want, and instead you'll just sink into the water. This is one of the things, again, that you'll have to experience yourself, but at the moment, Hyper Light Breaker feels bad in your hand. It's floaty and slow. The physics are all out of whack. Gravity is all out of whack. Collision is bad. No action game should stop you dead walking into a 4-inch curb. This is one of the most basic, core aspects of an action game, and the fact that it's not nailed down, even as the game is being sold for $30, is troubling. I guess I should note, however, that they pack in Hyper Light Drifter for that $30, but that didn't matter for me because I already own that game on 2 different platforms. For me, Hyper Light Breaker was $30, and it feels to me like it's somewhere in between a procedural terrain generation tech demo and an alpha when it comes to character movement and game feel. Either way, movement needs to be at least 10% faster, the player should not stop when hitting a curb or bumping a wall, the board needs to have actual gameplay involved, there needs to be a way to master it to get faster, the game needs to have rails like Solar Ash. As it stands, there's no gameplay to movement. If faster movement means that maps are too small, then increase the size of the map. Right now it feels bad to move, and just getting it to decent is not enough. For this game to succeed, it needs to feel good, and Heart Machine is painfully far away from that goal at the moment. Combat. Combat was a big part of Hyper Light Drifter, but it's almost certainly not what people remember that game for. Drifter is amazing because of its exploration, its world building, its tone, and its setting. But combat is a big part of the game, and while it's very simple, it is also very thoughtfully designed. And Drifter could afford to have simple but thoughtfully designed combat because that is not the game's most important feature. Hyper Light Breaker, on the other hand, is a co-op roguelite action game. As such, combat is the most important feature in the game. It's what you will spend most of your time doing. It's how you progress. It's the ultimate goal of the game. Combat can be a bit of an afterthought if you're making a brooding, artsy, indie Zelda-like, but it has to be nailed down and rock solid and fun as hell if you're making a co-op roguelite in a world that features a dozen other ridiculously great roguelite games. But sadly, in its current state, Breaker's combat isn't even close to good enough to carry the game. It's got decent enough bones, I suppose, and it's not actively terrible or anything, but not actively bad simply isn't good enough for a game in this genre. Not actively bad isn't going to cut it when you're releasing at the same time as Hades 2. The combat has many flaws that can be fixed, but it also has a bunch of design choices that leave me wondering if Heart Machine really understands the genre of game they are trying to make. Let's start with one of the craziest things about this game to me. In Hyper Light Drifter, you have a sword and you have a gun, just like in this game. In the first game, you recharge your gun by hitting enemies. It's literally the core of that game's combat loop, and it's the one genius design choice that makes the whole thing work. In fact, it's such a great idea that tons of other games took note and started using the same system in their games. Hyper Light Drifter might not have been the first game to do it, but after Drifter, a ton of games started using that exact same system. Whether to recharge heals, or ammo, or mana, or magic, it just became very common after Hyper Light Drifter. It was probably the most influential gameplay design choice to come out of the first game. Now, Hyper Light Breaker is literally set in the same universe. It also has a melee and gun system. Breaker takes a ton of visual design cues from the first game. It uses the same gear bits currency for upgrades. One would assume a game in the same universe, with so many similar design elements, would use the most influential and important one when it comes to gameplay design. But for some incomprehensible reason, no. You do not recharge your gun by hitting enemies in Breaker. Instead, you get ammo as random drops from some enemies and occasionally out of chests. And this change has cascading negative effects on everything from game feel to how bosses are designed. Now, again, this might seem like another small thing, but it's actually huge and emblematic of a muddled design that lacks the cohesive vision required to make a great roguelite. This same studio, in their first game, had a brilliant game design for how to balance melee and ranged attacks. They did it in a game that is set in the same universe as this one. This game would be significantly improved by simply using the same system as Drifter, and the fact that it doesn't says something troubling about the studio making the game. If this was a balance choice, it's a terrible one. Balance should never be the enemy of a game feeling good. This game could desperately use the dance of Drifter. That game's combat is all about alternating between melee and ranged attacks. It creates a high-stakes rhythm gameplay loop, and this game really needs that. Balance it by lowering how much energy you get from melee hits, or balance it with damage or enemy health. But the Drifter system would add a ton of options for increased depth, whether that's in items, builds, or gameplay, and this game desperately needs more depth. Beyond even that, sloppy design is all over the gameplay at the moment. Breaker is loaded with flying enemies that are just horrific to fight. You have to jump in the air to kill them, but you can only swing your weapon once, which feels so bad and clunky. It's almost impossible to hit flying enemies without locking onto them, but the game's lock-on is broken at its very core. It will lock onto enemies behind you and spin the camera around. It will suddenly turn the lock-on off for seemingly no reason. It's almost impossible to switch the lock-on from one enemy to another. Every boss fight has respawning dogs, and this lock-on means that you'll constantly get spun around to lock onto a dog behind you instead of the huge boss in front of you. I find it hard to believe this did not come up in player testing. My suspicion is the game locks onto the nearest enemy regardless of position, but that's probably the worst possible way to implement a target lock. I need to lock onto ranged enemies, or a flying enemy. What I don't need to do is lock onto a slow melee enemy who spawns behind me. What I don't need is for the lock-on to spin me away from a boss when parrying is super important. Better action games tend to prioritize whatever is in the center of your screen, but not Breaker. The game has a parry system, but I do not know why. It is so weakly implemented. Parrying gives almost no visual or audio cue that you have pulled it off. The only way to really know is that you get a few health back. But in chaotic fights with a ton of particle effects, parrying needs to matter. If you want this to be a core system of the game, a successful parry needs to have a loud audio cue. It needs to give you real benefits. Otherwise, it's just another finicky thing to take care of. The game is full of ground effects, but there's no interesting system for dealing with it. Movement, again, doesn't feel good. You can't do multiple attacks in the air. Nothing in the combat system feels cohesive at all. All of these little things, and they are little things, but all of them add up, along with the movement, to make the game simply feel bad to play. Almost every small choice the devs have made here is not the right one. There needs to be way more skill expression. The player needs to be able to do multiple attacks in the air. The player should be able to dash to extend combos. The lock-on needs to not be broken. The ammo system is a disaster. The parry system is underbaked for something that seems to be core to the design. It's a very bad sign when a game launches with more things wrong in its core systems than are right, and none of this stuff is even the most important problem the game has at the moment. Itemization. I'm obviously not a game designer. I'm a manual laborer. But I like games, and over the years I've come to believe that the best ones come out of a cohesive vision born of a question. I like to imagine that something like Hades began with the question, what if we took our unique approach to storytelling and married it to an action game? And from there, they probably arrived at the roguelite genre through natural evolution and iteration. The best version of Hyperlight Breaker probably would have begun with the question, what if we made Hyperlight Drifter, but as a 3D action game? But after having watched a ton of stuff about the development of this game, including the NoClip documentary, I have come to think that Hyperlight Breaker was not born out of a desire to make a Hyperlight game, but rather it seems to have been born out of an interesting engineering challenge.
These different biomes together and procedurally generate one level, the entire open world.
What we're going to do instead is the Pangea method. And what that means is other biomes will be combined in a single map for a true open world experience in a roguelike structure for the first time ever. We get to retain our large individual biome sizes with plenty of exploration here, plenty of things to fight, plenty of things to collect, but now everything is more unique. Now everything is more clear. Now everything is more navigable. The size and scale finally feels right. It is starting to click. This is a very big aha moment for us.
Almost everything you read about this game focuses heavily on the procedural generation of the open world maps. I am sure that that was an interesting nut to crack for all the very smart people in the studio, but it's not a particularly interesting thing for the player of a video game. And designing a game around procedural map generation creates way more problems than it does solutions. If procedural map generation is the technology that drove the creation of the game, well then a roguelite is probably the only genre that's even possible. But this is getting game design backwards. A roguelite may be the only genre that works with procedural open worlds, but procedural open worlds don't necessarily make for a great roguelite. My hunch is that Heart Machine has spent years getting this map technology to work, and has only recently begun designing a game to work with it. In fact, the gameplay reveal was over a year ago, and the two bosses shown are the only two bosses in the game, and the enemies in that trailer are the only enemies in the game. And the weapons shown seem to be the only weapons in the game. There's almost nothing in this game that wasn't shown in that reveal over a year ago. And frankly, there isn't nearly enough in the game to sustain more than about 5 hours of gameplay. More importantly, if a studio is going to make a roguelite, they need to have a real handle on what makes the genre tick. Nobody should make a roguelite unless they really love playing games in that genre. And the current version of Breaker doesn't seem to understand what people love about roguelites. Every successful one, from Isaac, Nuclear Throne, and Gungeon, to Risk of Rain 2, Hades, and Dead Cells, have both excellent game feel and a laser focus on crazy item synergy and the creation of broken builds. The entire reason to play these games is because you know, sooner or later, you will end up with a build that trivializes the balance of the game. You know that every so often, the entire way the game plays will change. It's a genre that exists, literally exists, to break balance. The reason Isaac became the first massive blockbuster is because that game allows for ridiculous variance in builds. Sooner or later, you will end up with the Guppy transformation, or a Brimstone and Tammy's head build, or any one of hundreds of ridiculous and insane synergies that fundamentally change the game at its core. Dead Cells and Risk of Rain 2 offer the same massive gameplay changes depending upon what items you find. You can use pure skill to get very far in Isaac or Dead Cells with terrible item luck, but you will keep playing because you know at some point a crazy set of items will come together. This is the very bottom, basic core of the genre. It is the key. It's what makes the entire experience. And Breaker has precisely none of that. Literally none. Every single thing about the item and weapon economy fundamentally misunderstands the appeal of the genre of game Heart Machine is trying to make. First of all, the best items and weapons are bought at your base from vendors and not found in the world or taken off bosses, which is insane. The core of the experience is the rush of finding the perfect item and having a synergistic build come together through luck. Checking a vendor between runs isn't fun. If there are going to be vendors at all, they need to be only bad luck protection, but definitely not the core of the item experience. But more importantly, you cannot make a successful roguelite if the best items are all about increasing the damage of your sword or gun. Massively increasing health and damage does not change the game at all. It just makes things die quicker. In order to make this game successful, items need to change how you play the game. That would mean items that, make a laser beam fire around you after 2 swings. And then an item that makes laser beams poison things. And then an item that makes enemies that are poisoned explode. That's what a roguelite has to feel like. Roguelike itemization needs to be creative and crazy. There are none, literally no, successful games in the genre that do not have this. Even the earliest games in the genre, like Spelunky, understand this. You cannot make a game that I have to play over and over, where the goal is to increase my weapon damage. You cannot make a roguelike where every run is basically exactly the same aside from map locations. Obviously, more items will be released through early access, but the fact that in 16 hours I quite literally did not find even one item that made the game feel any different from hour 1 implies that the devs either don't understand the genre, or perhaps are hamstrung by the extremely insane decision to make this a Hyperlight Drifter sequel. Which leads us to the last section. Why is this a sequel? Now there's an obvious answer to that question, of course. A sequel to Hyperlight Drifter was certain to get press attention and likely to generate far more fan attention than Heart Machine announcing yet another indie roguelite, except this time with a procedural open-world map generation technology that doesn't really affect gameplay, but is a super cool problem the engineers in the studio had been working on. Heart Machine has an IP that is popular. Hyperlight Drifter has over 13,000 reviews on Steam, while Solar Ash has about 1,000. I follow a developer on Substack who writes about the industry, and he has a formula for estimating game sales based upon Steam reviews. The ratio has changed over time, but according to his formula, Hyperlight Drifter probably sold around 650,000 copies on Steam alone, while Solar Ash probably sold closer to 30,000 units on Steam. Now, Solar Ash was on Game Pass, and I'm sure it had revenue generated elsewhere, but it's a simple fact that Drifter was a significant hit, and Solar Ash was not. So, it was a natural choice to make their next game a sequel to Drifter to try and put the studio back on firmer financial footing. In fact, I'd argue that was the objectively correct choice for a business to make. But there are problems with trying to marry the Hyperlight IP to a co-op roguelite game, and none of them seem to have been solved yet. Hyperlight Drifter is beloved because of its tone and atmosphere. It feels dark and grounded. It's depressing and mysterious. It's violent and creepy in many places. It feels like you're exploring a world that is ending, where civilization has broken down and cute little animals are fleeing enemies who are skinning them alive after enslaving them. It is pretty dark, is what I'm saying here, and it's also very grounded. It feels real. There are no crazy abilities. Everything feels real and possible. But a roguelite cannot be grounded, and a co-op game can't be lonely and mysterious. I don't think it's crazy to say you literally could not pick a worse fit genre-wise for Hyperlight Drifter than a co-op roguelite. This presents a problem that only has 2 answers. Either you have to throw away the tone and atmosphere and lean into what makes a co-op roguelite work, or you have to keep the tone and atmosphere and design the roguelite in a way that stays true to the first game. And the latter of those is much, much harder. I'm a guy who's constantly full of suggestions, but I can't even imagine a way to both stay true to the first game, but also make a fun roguelite. I actually don't think it can be done, frankly. So my suggestion to Heart Machine is, forget about the name. It is a sunk cost at this point. You made the initial bad choice to not just make a 3D Drifter sequel, which would have been a massive Titanic hit, by the way, and now you are too far along to change that. Now you need to forget the name and make a great roguelite. That means rock solid game feel, faster movement, crazy abilities and items. It means letting players break the balance every 10 runs. It means being able to finish a combo in the air and then dash and combo 3 more times. Everything has to be around game feel and gameplay. That's the basic goal you must hit for this to not be a sales and critical disaster. You still have a bunch of goodwill with this name, and it's keeping people from fully unloading on the game in its current form, but that's not gonna last. After getting the game to feel great, and making items and progression feel interesting enough to be worth playing, you still haven't solved the core problem you've created with the open world procedural generation. Where does it go from here? Is the final vision that you clear 2 or 3 open worlds in a row? Meaning 9 bosses and 6 hours for each completion? Runs are going to be very, very long if that's the case. If each success requires more than 1 map, and it must be because there's just not enough here to have each run only include 1 map, how does that work with multiplayer? This is being sold for $30, and that's fine. I totally understand raising money through the early access system. But it feels like the studio hasn't even figured out what the final game is here. This feels like it's in a pre-alpha game design state. Again, I've played for over 16 hours and found only a few things I like, and wrote thousands of words, and I can't figure out what the final gameplay loop is going to be. Is it that you clear 1 map and move on, and then you'll do it all again on a second map and do it all again on a third map? Or are you going to run through all 3 maps each time? I don't know. Co-op and a relatively large open world don't necessarily mix well with a roguelite, which is supposed to be built around short runs and drop-in, drop-out play. I'm not confident that Heart Machine has fully answered any of these questions internally yet. And the fact that I don't know the answer to some of these questions is pretty troubling, I think. Now, I'm rooting for this game because I like the studio and I loved the first game. And even though I didn't love Solar Ash, I respected it quite a bit. But after playing through everything that's here, I'm left in what I imagine is the same place the developers are, staring at more questions than answers. Alright, I'm really sick, have been for 2 weeks, which is very annoying. That's probably why my voice sounds like this. Alright, thanks for coming. I'll see you next time. Bye.